Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I am delighted this afternoon to be joined by Raul Burbano. He's a journalist, he's the director of Common Frontiers, and he's also a member of the Colombian Working Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Raul.
Thank you very much for having me, Sylvia. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
In some ways disheartening that every time we meet is about some kind of, new layer of impunity. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite poets, Eduardo Galeano said, does history repeat itself, or are the repetitions only penance for those of us who refuse to remember, or have been incapable of listening? So I wonder if we could start the conversation by talking a little bit about the new layers of impunity that we're experiencing, that people in Colombia are living with, and to perhaps deconstruct a little bit, not only the zenith of this problem, where it all sort of is rooted, but also what we as citizens can do.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for that question. And I think it's just very inspiring with also what's happening. There's always, wherever there's sort of, chaos and challenge, there's also an opportunity. And what we're seeing, at least in Colombia and a whole bunch of other countries in Latin America, is that there's a strong awakening, from people, whether it's in Colombia in the last couple of days, in Chile, in Ecuador, where, thousands and thousands of people are taken to the streets, also in Bolivia not too long ago, to demand, respect for human rights, for democracy, an end to the austerity and neoliberal policies that many of these governments, specifically just recently in Colombia with the Duque government, they're trying to impose in order to salvage their countries from, I would say the capitalist onslaught, which is, the economic crisis which a lot of these countries find themselves in. So, definitely there's a reaction from the states, and often it's violent, and it's repressive and it's menacing, but it also forces people to come together and to struggle in a wonderful way. And we see that today in Colombia, where people are out on the street en masse, singing, dancing, music, fighting, kind of pushing back against what is a very difficult situation, but so far, is turning around where the people are, in essence, are starting to take control. It gives us a lot of hope and energy for the future, where a community, very diverse. For example, in Colombia today, it's sort of organic. There's nobody really leading that. Everybody's a part of it. Teachers, labor organizations, indigenous, Afro-Colombians. They all have very diverse demands, very diverse visions. But the most important part is that they're all together today out on the streets, pushing back against what is a very fascist and oppressive government, and it's given a lot of hope in terms of that there finally could be some change again in countries like Colombia and Latin America, where we've seen a bit of a very difficult situation with a lot of right-wing governments coming into power to impose liberal policies, austerity, anti-democratic policies like we see in Colombia today.
I think the word recordar for me it's the word that means to awake, and also it means to remember. So perhaps we can not only celebrate our ability to continue to remember despite the violence, that we are people, that we deserve to live with dignity, and to honor that this comes with a price, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of price that we are seeing exerted on the populace, on the people of Colombia, because as of this week, right, this is the second week where we've seen the government of President Ivan Duque, not only militarizing life, right, responding with bullets to people's call for, not only an arrest to the neoliberalist agenda, but also a stop to the continuous violence against workers.
Absolutely. And I think we're starting to see this a lot more and more, especially with the pandemic and the crisis that's taking place through the neoliberal model, is that governments are looking for people to kind of shoulder the costs of the socio-economic and political crisis, that an environmental crisis that we're going to. But at the same time, they want to let corporations off the hook. And I think it's really important when we're seeing, movements across Latin America, North America, and other countries that are starting to challenge that and come together. And like you said, it's done in very different ways, and the struggles are very different, and they look, completely, maybe look odd to other folks. For example, big dance parties in Colombia on the streets when there's massive tanks on the streets, shooting at people, as you said, but people are singing songs, people are playing instruments. It's really incredible how people are, in essence, are creating their own paradise within a bit of chaos in order to show their resistance and in order to show their opposition to really what countries have been doing, which is just, destroying the environment, stealing the resources, creating a precarity that is unimaginable, over the last little bit. For example, Colombia is one of the most unequal country in Latin America. Uh, about, according to most estimates, conservative estimates, it's about 45 to 50%, but the reality is a lot higher. Probably about 60% of Colombians, that's about 27, million people live in poverty. Although Colombia has been held up as a model, a great model of democracy, a great model of economic prosperity for many years. So it just goes to show us the contradictions of what we hear in real life and then what's really happening on the ground for people in Colombia.
Let's talk a little bit about the way that we have not only been learning resilience as we deal with the calamities of 30 years plus, neoliberalism and dictatorship and militarization of our streets, but also how do we keep ourselves engaged and energized by the dream of creating a society with justice.
That's a good question. And I think sort of the pandemic, that we're all living in right now has kind of forced us to rethink our lives. Everybody before was really busy with work and continuously, being kept busy with all their hobbies and shopping and all the stuff that people do. And now with the pandemic, we kind of have to force to retreat and start kind of thinking inward and really what's important to us. And what we're seeing and what you see is that, everybody's focused now. You're more at home. You're more, around nature. You're less being able to go, for example, people always supposed to spend the pastime in malls. Now most people are going for walks, right, in parks, in nature. So I think it's really reconnecting to the roots of where most of us get the most joy and satisfaction, whether we kind of think of that consciously or subconsciously, which is within our community, within our family, within our friends, and living within those spaces and remembering that those are where we get the most nourishment, the most knowledge, and as you mentioned, and within that, building that historical context so we don't forget where we come from and where we are. And for example, like there's, millions of Colombians today across Canada, across, Europe and the world who today might have little connection or contact with Colombia, but yet today are on the streets, calling for support for Colombians who are on the front lines against the Duque government because of repressive policies, are coming together for something that they have, really in Toronto probably have not done before, as an example, or in other cities across Canada. It's wonderful to see a couple thousand Colombians from diverse backgrounds as a community coming together and kind of celebrating who we are as diverse people politically, socially, economically, but yet under sort of one roof and celebrating who we are and celebrating the struggles and also celebrating the dream that everybody really wants the same dream, which is, that we live in harmony with the earth, that we live in harmony with one another, and that we build a collective, a community where we can all prosper and live life in a way that's meaningful for all of us in whatever that context is.
One of the things that became very clear to me as a child was that we live in multiple worlds all the time. As an indigenous person, you live with this call to be in connection, not just with your parents, but also with nature, right? With the I remember as a child, it was very common to walk by yourself. There were trees, and now after the war, of course, the bombs and all the things that destroyed made it very untenable for us to be able to walk, and let alone to be able to walk alone. So, what we lose, I think, is not just when we become forgetful about the kind of violence that allows, 1/5 of the population of the world to consume, 80% of all the resources, and to, pollute the world with plastic and with cars, right? When we become forgetful that this kind of lifestyle has a cost, and that cost is exerted not on the people who are buying their trinkets here, but on people thousands of miles away. So I wonder if we talk about, not just what has naturalized this level of impunity as we see with the government, but perhaps the connection, because it's really important to remember that Colombia is one of those places where it was most unlikely for you to see revolutionary uprising of the people. There's 7 military bases in Colombia, a large support by U.S. Money to support the military there, and the government. So it's very unlikely. You just the level of repression that people face to speak up, and for years now, Colombia has been known as one of the most dangerous places for union activists. So how is this possible, and why is it important for us to remember those facts?
The capitalist model does a great job of sort of severing the ties that we have with each other, with the environment, with the things that are really important to us, and we become focused on consumption and materialism. And I think within the Colombian context is the strong influence of U.S. involvement, as you mentioned, the militarization of Colombia through bases has become a key kind of component for investment around the world. So there's been lots of Canadian investment in mining and other oil and gas, and from other sectors in the U.S. And it's really around creating a country like Colombia that is stable from a capital perspective, where investment come in, and then it could also be used as a way to I guess, kind of subjugate or to marginalize anything else in the region. For example, there's the talk of Colombianization of, the military in other countries, where Colombia is great at teaching, military personnel in other countries, like in Chile, for example, how to defeat protest type of thing on the streets. So the way that Colombia has been sort of divided, and all those people don't see themselves as, like part of that, the Bolivarian family or the Latin American family in terms of Colombia, because it's been so different politically, socially, and economically. And I think, as you mentioned, no one really expected that the kind of social uprising that's so spontaneous in Colombia. It's been a culture of war, right? Colombians in general have been at war with, whether it's the guerrilla, with communism, the war against drugs, the war against terrorism. It's been a country that has been, I would say, almost traumatized with the fact that we must destroy an internal enemy that has been obviously created as for a political sense. And and it's never dawned on folks that, hey, this is a repressive kind of environment and world that we're living in. But what's happening today in Colombia, is not new. There's been quite a lot of social movement uprisings over the last couple of years. So I would say this is a continuation of it. The difference that's happening today from, let's say, last year when the Minga and the Paro Nacional was taking place, is that it's so large and it's so broad, right? It encompasses more than just the political actors or social movement that historically, like the indigenous movement, the Afro-Colombians, the labor movement, that have historically been very active in Colombia. But now we're talking about, just your average folks, people who have realized that we can no longer live in this kind of model where the government now is going to tax me on, basic services that I have when I'm barely surviving, where pension is going to be taxed. How are they supposed to live? Where public sector workers, this is part of, the tax, components that Duque imposes, that he was going to freeze public sector wages for, 5-6 years, all to pay for the economic crisis that really comes from, for example, an unlimited amount of spending on military in order to fight all the wars that I mentioned, right? So I think that it's important we see that connection that, Colombia and Colombians see themselves as part of the larger Latin American family in terms of that that there's a struggle, and that struggle needs to connect with others, and you see that now in the spontaneous and so large protests across the country that it's very difficult to see the violence by the state, but it's also very inspirational to see that within Colombia, you know, so much of this has come forward now finally in a unified voice that's saying basta, enough with the violence, enough with the anti-democratic policies by the state, and it almost feels like there is like an immense shift that has erupted in Colombia, and for the first time in a long time, I'm hoping that there is going to be a real significant political change, because in the past the government has been able to sort of undermine all these movements by saying, sure, no problem, we will engage in dialogue, and then sort of let that energy dissipate and then move on, and then we get another set of repression. But it feels like this time, potentially in Colombia, there is going to be a shift, and we will finally see, a true democracy that represents the people, that cares about the Colombians, that seeks to protect the environment, and that really shifts away from that militarization and war mindset that has been, in my mind, sort of, imposed on people through fear and violence.
Can we talk a little bit about the different movements, the social movements that are not only alive but thriving in Latin America, and in particular in the southern region, because we have seen so much struggle in this region. We've seen how the Mingas, as you point out, indigenous-led movements have really awakened not just the imagination of people, right, but also the responsibility that we have a responsibility to coexist and to coexist well with life.
And that's true what you say. I mean, the indigenous movements, the Afro movements, across the Americas, in Colombia, for specifically the Afro-Colombian groups, have been, at the front lines for, I would say, 500 years since, colonization, in the struggle to protect the lands, in order to protect their culture. And it's they've done this against colonizers, whether it's from the region or from other countries, whether it's from multinational corporations, whether it's from paramilitaries, drug, crime. But really, it's those communities, the indigenous communities, the Afro communities, who have maintained a strong portion of their culture, a family of collective struggle, and continue that struggle today. And I think that they have been, from my experience, they have been have given people hope. They have been a sense of incredible strength and fighting, that people look to those communities as a form of, like, for example, like in La Indígena Guardia in parts of Colombia, where they're using their traditional ways and moving away from sort of the capitalist, or the judicial or the democratic systems that we're used to in the West, and are going back to their traditions, traditions which are much more based on collective, which are much more based on sort of an equity type of model, where it's not about punishment or it's not about economic punishment, but rather is how do we strengthen the community, right? How do we better people rather than punish them and put them in jail, and build a healthier society that is not just important for humans, but it's also linked to the environment. For example, when they look at what's good for the future, they don't think of just what's good for short term or for themselves. They, in some of the indigenous cultures, they think of what's better for the seventh generation, and that's how long term they're thinking in terms of when they think of the environment. They're saying we don't care, for example, to have in some communities to have mining, for example, if we're just going to reap the benefits for the next 5-10 years and then we don't have our land. What's the use of mining projects, for example, in a lot of these communities? And often people in the West don't understand that. They don't say, well, why wouldn't you just want to have a job and make some money, and then you can buy all the materialism in a very short period of time? But they're always thinking, long term, at least, 7 generations down. And I think those are the communities that all across, Latin America, the Americas, who have been on the front lines, through culture, through song, through a historical connection with these issues, that many communities now are sort of, following and taking the lead and working as closely as possible with in order to maintain those struggles.
It's not only inspiring to imagine that we can create a world where we are in coexistence, where we are being responsible, to be able to respond. We didn't create capitalism, at least not you and I, but we are responsible for transforming, for changing the way our society is organized, for the way, the land is cared for the way our children are nourished and educated, right? To grow up respecting, nature, respecting other people. I wonder what's the lesson here, and how do we not only move forward in a way that brings us all in step, to co-creating the world we want to see.
It's important to keep in mind that, there is a finite resources in the world in terms of water, trees, and we can't just continue to consume at the pace we are because, as you said, the inevitable challenges we're going to see is, the environmental destruction, the impacts of climate change, and even as you said, the impacts to health, right? The viruses that we're seeing and the illnesses that people are being impacted, a lot of this is due to the impact of on the environment, as you said, and the way we're destroying our culture and the bonds in which we live in. And the only focus is really on materialism and production of technology that in many senses killing us because now most people don't even go for walks anymore due to their time they spend on their computers and their phones. I mean, if it wasn't for the pandemic, people would still probably wouldn't be out at all. So it's really important that we see that need to continue to remember where we come from, where we're linked to, and how we can build towards a better future. And the link to community for me, I think, is always the connection, right? The link to community, the link to the environment, is where we remember where we come from and where we can go. And as we build our community and we fight within that community, it could be for from a budgeting perspective to making sure that stop signs are the right signs are in your neighborhood, to protect your children, to protect your family. You know, to me, that's where everything kind of starts and begins, and then we build from there, and then we connect that there are struggles around the world that are just as important and are related to what we do. And I think, for example, people are starting to realize, especially workers, as you were saying, that we need to remember that our struggles are all linked. So as workers, for example, before the free trade agreements, there was, the manufacturing sector in Canada was very strong. People were getting paid well. They had union jobs, making lots of money. And then we started to get into free trade agreements. And what ended up happening is corporations said, well, why do we want to pay, auto workers in Canada so much money when they're unionized when we can just ship those jobs to Mexico? And then workers in Canada started realizing, well, wait a minute, is the fault the Mexican workers or is it the system? In some cases, workers, would blame the Mexican workers, but I think with time they realized that, hey, we're all workers and we're all struggling, and if we better the conditions of all of us, then we can all win collectively. But when we only struggle to better ourselves, for example, which is obviously important, we all need to struggle, but when we only limit those struggles to ourselves and we don't link them to the national or the international, then in the end we still end up losing because the corporations will definitely take advantage of that. So the problems we have are systematic and international, and the solutions then have to be as well international. And I think solidarity is the key to that. I think the solution to most of the issues we have politically, economically, is solidarity. When we build links of solidarity in any struggle globally, is when we can win. For example, as we see today, international solidarity with Colombia is incredible. All over Canada, I've seen thousands of people on the streets. To be in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Colombia is the same as with, I'm seeing today thousands of people in solidarity with Palestinians who today are feeling, bombs being dropped upon them. So it's incredible to see the solidarity, and that's what builds the links of struggle. And when we struggle together, we build those true links of solidarity.
I was talking to some coworkers, and universities are very interesting places because this is where the people with most privilege coexist, right? They come there because they can afford to pay for higher education. And a lot of people also don't have privilege. They simply work really hard and have multiple jobs to pay. But my point is that you get to university and you think that you would feel like so powerful and able to affect change. And a lot of the times, these are exactly the places where people are most frightened, to take action. They just think, oh, I have to wait till I have a right, till I get a right. And I wonder if you could just perhaps remind us, right, of that spirit of moving with others and co-creating with others and realizing we don't have to get it right. We just have to work with others so that we're moving and acting in reciprocity. We're not just being the Lone Ranger trying to save the world.
I get that sense all the time as well, and it's in different settings. It could be the academic settings. Sometimes you see it in the labor movement. Sometimes you see it in whatever movement you're in, the NGO movement. Really what often ends up happening is when we disconnect ourselves from the struggle, then it becomes theoretical, and I think that's where the challenge is. The key in order to build that true reciprocity and solidarity within anywhere, my experience a lot is within the labor movement, is when we're in struggle together. So it's not just good enough to put out, for example, a statement and say we are in solidarity with people struggling, but it's when you realize that you are in those same struggles and then you struggle as well. I think a perfect example is Colombia. There's many reasons why people are out on the streets today in Colombia, but one of the main reasons is to fight an austerity agenda, like a neoliberal austerity agenda. It is the same austerity agenda that we fight here in Canada, that people and that workers fight all over the world. The people in Colombia want jobs. They want to end the precarity. They want to have access to health. They want to have access to the vaccines, basic things that is the same things that we all want here in Canada. And if we forget that they're struggling for the same reasons that we struggle, and if they win, if they can beat back austerity agenda, which at the moment they've forced the Duque government to retreat on its agenda, which is an incredible feat based on the amount of violence and repression that they have experienced, then it's a sign for us here in Canada and for people, I would say in the global north and maybe in the universities and in the areas that when we see people are afraid to struggle, that it shows us that people can overcome all these adversaries with a lot more difficulty than we have. We're fortunate in the north that we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of financial capital, and we could do a lot. But often, as you said, is that fear, that will I lose my job, that fear, will I lose my title, will I not get that next promotion, that sometimes separates us from really, building those close links with struggles. And I think the key is that we realize that, we're all workers, most of us, and we link those struggles together. And the reason why we support Colombians who are fighting a neoliberal austerity agenda is for the same reason that I would fight a neoliberal austerity agenda here in Canada. And I think when we build those kind of links, when the struggles are joined, I'm not just in solidarity with Colombians, I'm in solidarity with myself, I'm in solidarity with my community, and together we build those links of solidarity, which are key in order to really understand and struggle together. So I think continuing to struggle, even if you're in the university level, we can't disconnect ourselves. It can't be theoretical. It has to be a practical application of struggle, which I think is the root of how you build solidarity.
Thank you so much for being with us and not only inviting us into engagement with life cycle, because in many ways our struggles are inviting cycles of life, a new vision of what can be, a life that is interdependent, in solidarity, in mutual reciprocity. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much for having us.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com.